Hello, I'm Dean Whiting from Pathology Technology Australia. We're the peak body representing the manufacturers and suppliers of the technology and the tests used in healthcare settings, in pathology labs, in hospitals, and in the primary care setting. Our members supply more than 95% of all the tests performed in Australia. Today we launch the first of our member profiles. And today we have Mr. John Kelly, the Managing Director and CEO of Atomo Diagnostics. And I started off by asking John the origins of the name Atomo. Enjoy.
Well, Atomo is ancient Greek, and it roughly translates as the individual or the self, and that was really the idea behind the business, with a view to delivering diagnostics to market that were much more suited for individuals to use rather than, dependent on lab processes.
Right, and that's really the mantra of your business here, and that leads sort of to the next question. And what's the innovation that you're best known for?
Yeah, well, before we came along, lateral flow immunoassay products were delivered outside of the lab in a bits in a box kit, like a year 12 chemistry set, and as those tests were deployed in doctor offices, in-field screening programs, in pharmacies and in the home, their complexity, and their lack of usability just made them really not fit for purpose. So Atomo's goal was to really just consumerize that process down to make it really point of care friendly.
Yeah, and that really answers the second part of the question, I guess. Why is it important? And it's important because it's very easy to use.
Well, it's important because there's a number of studies that show that manufacturers of rapid tests claim lab-based levels of performance, and yet studies the world over show that the ability of an untrained user or even a semi-trained professional user to get that performance in the field, those real levels of usability impact real-world performance. And our goal was to allow someone in the field to get the same level of performance that the products can deliver in the lab, and really take that user error out of the equation.
And if I'm not wrong, the products are very versatile. It can be adapted to a whole range of different kinds of tests that can be used inside the products.
Yeah, so the IP itself sits around any diagnostic technology. It's not limited to lateral flow immunoassay, but the platform itself that we've designed and commercialized specifically for blood-based immunoassay testing, that's a platform that can really accommodate any test strip, as long as the blood volume's between 5 and 70 microliters and the buffer reagent between 20 and 200. We can deliver it into our device with minimal re-engineering, minimal revalidation. Really, it's just a case of putting some equivalency studies together to show improved performance over the standard kit.
And if we move then to really the main purpose of this discussion, and it's the same discussion I'm having with a number of other Australian point of care test innovators, is around the barriers we face in commercialisation. So can you outline where the main barriers that Atomo faced are to commercialising your innovation in Australia?
Yeah, well, I think there's probably two main structural barriers. I think the first one is that there's a real lack of venture capital funding for medical device technology and diagnostic technology. So I think it's hard to fund, and a lot of Australian companies have to bootstrap, which means that you really struggle to scale globally because you don't have the capital. Obviously, being in Australia means there's additional constraints around getting to conferences, getting to customers, but I think the main one for us in the early days was access to capital. I think the other structural problem is that although there's a lot of really good point of care innovation being delivered to market in Australia, the Australian public health system is structurally resistant to point of care. I think through overzealous promotion of lab services and issues with reimbursement. I think all of that makes local product commercialization difficult, and it's always hard to commercialize a product globally when you don't have a home market that you can point to help sort of provide credibility and validate the technology.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, and it's a topic for another day, but there's a whole range of reasons why we do need a manufacturing hub of excellence in Australia, and why a local market is important to that. Having TGA imprimatur, for example, means we can more easily market these products overseas. So Anyway, let's get on.
Sounds like another interview.
Yeah, it sounds like another interview, doesn't it? Sounds like another topic. What are some of the options the government ought to be considering, to offer more direct incentives to smaller companies that have great inventions
I think our experience with the government, both federal and state, has been quite positive in terms of support. In the early stages, we got a Commercialisation Australia grant. We got a federal grant for some product development. Separate to that, we got a grant from the New South Wales Medical Devices Fund. So we have had support locally, and obviously the R&D rebate is substantial. We spent a lot of money on development activities. So I think there is on the ground support from government, and that's to be encouraged. I think where I would like to see more support is on the scale up beyond proof of concept. So you've got your concept, you've got your customers, you've got your regulatory approval. How do you move from making batches of 10,000 to 10 million? And what's the onshore support to do that? I'm mindful that the US government has been writing some very substantial checks for diagnostic companies to scale, and that level of industrial support just doesn't seem to be here. And what's also lacking here, I think, is a Buy Australian policy. American companies get preferential treatment from US government tenders. I don't see the same things happening from my engagement with New South Wales Pathology or any of the state or federal purchasing groups.
So we could be manufacturing here, we could be using the products here, and that would help you with the scale up, it would help you with the cash flow management and all those sorts of things, but they just don't happen here at the moment, do they?
There doesn't seem to be a willingness to have a meaningful conversation at that level of scale. No.
Which is really odd, because if we invest in the innovation phases, if we invest in the tertiary institutions, the translation, we invest in the small startups who want to take on the verification and validation of the product, then you get to scale up and you have to take your invention offshore because there's no opportunity to really scale here in Australia.
Or if not take the business offshore, at least the manufacturing. I think it also comes down to where the demand is. So, we've developed the world's first fully integrated rapid blood test. We've got a COVID product that's TGA approved on that platform. But, we've sold 2 million units to France. We've done a deal for a take or pay for 2 million units to a partner in the US. Yet we can't really get any traction with any of the local State Department purchasing groups for local deployment. Now that tells me there's a structural issue. Clearly the product, if it meets the requirements for the French Ministry of Defence, it's a good product. And why is there no local demand for locally made product? I don't know, but that's a structural challenge.
I think so. I think it's policy and funding to me, and I think they're the two areas that we need to deal with. And that's really sort of the meat of the next question is, how can industry and government work more collaboratively together to foster an environment that's attractive to pull the funding in that you're talking about? What do we need to do? What does government and business need to do?
I think government needs to reconsider where it supports and how it supports research. So I think one of the challenges with the Australian ecosystem is that Australian research is world class, and the government's very, rightly very proud of that. But all or nearly all of the money goes into funding research, and the amount of money or the percentage of money that's spent on the translation of research is by OECD standards really, really low. And I think for every dollar spent on research broadly, there has to be more than a couple of cents in the dollar of that targeted to the later stage translation. That's where Australia falls down.
Yeah, no, I get that. You had a very successful IPO in 2020. Tell us about that journey and what were some of the pitfalls that you faced?
Yeah, well, I think the planning started for that several years out. We integrated SAP into our operations system quite early in the piece. We started to get our accounts audited by one of the big four, so we really set out our stall in advance of that run to market, and I think that was hugely helpful. We also brought in some experts that had a track record in delivering IPOs, and it's not the kind of process you want to cut corners on because it's counterproductive to do that. Even with all that planning and having the roadmap well defined, we obviously struggled to close out the IPO during the middle of the pandemic. That timing was unavoidable, but we were able to pivot the business quite quickly into COVID. And within the first couple of months of the pandemic breaking, we secured a very sizable contract with Europe for our devices for COVID, and I think that reinforced to the market the fact that our platform was hugely flexible in terms of how quickly it could be redeployed into different applications, and I think that to some degree proved our point to the market that this was a platform that really was versatile. So that the logistics of trying to launch during the IPO during the pandemic were challenging. We did the first virtual bell ring in the history of the ASX. So we rang the bell. It was actually my mother-in-law's Tibetan singing bowl that we rang because the bell from the ASX turned up late. But that was an experience, I suppose. But yeah, I think being listed and being in lockdown, the two ideally wouldn't be happening at the same time. But you make the most of it, and we've done quite well to come through that and get listed on the other side.
Amazing job. Our time is up, unfortunately, but maybe we'll circle back on a couple of these things again in the future. It just remains for me to thank you, John, for participating, and to let everybody know that simultaneous with the release of this podcast and videocast, there'll also be a case study summarising Atomo's journey with the products that we're talking about here, and that'll be on our website at the same time as we launch this podcast. So thanks very much, John.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah. You're welcome.